Hey everyone, Tommy Durfler here with Sam Rice on the Lighthouse Wealth Group Spotlight Podcast. Thanks for everybody for joining. And Sam, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about estate planning, what it is, what are some of the pitfalls, and kind of how to get started with that whole process.
Man, what a fun one, huh? Nobody likes to
I
talk about
know,
estate planning and what happens if they pass away.
but it's important, right?
Yeah, it's definitely important. So, why don't you give us a little bit of overview? Like, what when we say estate planning, obviously that's kind of something that's more jargon in our world, but what does
Yeah.
that really mean?
So it's on an overview stating what your wishes would be for your accounts, your property, if something were to happen to you, and yourself, if something were to happen to you in an incapacitation circumstance, or the thing that people don't like to talk about is also death. So what are your wishes when something like that would occur? And just to give context, we don't draft any of these here at Lighthouse Wealth Group, but it's definitely an important part of your full financial plan to address all these things with a licensed attorney.
Yeah. So let's talk about for a second what happens if you don't do these things, right? Because I'm sure some listeners kind of like, okay, that's great, but if I forget to do this or if I just choose not to, what will happen then? So basically, what happens is if you were to pass away at some point, which we are all going to do, and you do not have a written will, then your estate, right, all the things that you own, will go to the state, and then they will start deciding who gets what.
That's right.
And during that time, they can have anybody come forward and basically say who has a claim or thinks they have a claim to these things that, Tommy owned while he was alive. And so they have to go through this pretty extensive process of, let's say a long lost cousin came around and said, "Oh yeah, well Tommy owed me, $10 30 years ago. In today's world, that's
Yeah.
worth X amount of dollars. I have a claim to that."
Yeah.
Now the judge has to decide, okay, is this valid or is it not? And, obviously you do that and that ties up the estate and it can kind of become a little bit of a mess.
The debt collectors can come out of the woodworks.
Yeah. And just
Yep.
you hear these stories of, people fighting over certain estates and all that stuff. So, what we want to talk about today is really, what to do to mitigate all of that and give you enough education to kind of give you a foundation to work off of and maybe even go see somebody, an attorney, a qualified professional if you haven't already.
That's right. And we did some research as well, and it turns out, according to care.com, only 32% of all Americans have a will. How shocking is that?
That's wild.
Yeah,
And I think the things that I've run into is the fact that not a lot of people really like to think or discuss this.
that's right.
Nobody really
It's
sits
the
there
last
and
thing you want to
says,
talk about in most cases.
yeah, I mean, nobody wants to sit there and say, okay, Sam, you're going to have to sit down with you and Aaron, and you are going to have to decide what happens, who gets the kids. And you're going to have to start thinking through these scenarios of if one of you aren't around or both of you aren't around. And, quite honestly, who wants to think about that on your day off or
I
a
know.
weekend or something like that, or after, work one day? Nobody really wants to think through that. But is extremely important. And that's why I think, about a third of Americans really only have done this.
I know. It's something a lot of people don't think about, and definitely an important piece to your overall financial picture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things, obviously, we talked about your assets, gives guidelines to those, but it also gives guidelines to if you have minor children, what were to happen to them, who would take
Yeah.
care of them. So another really important part, as new parents or what have you, new families start to grow, having direction for, if a worst case scenario, what would happen to your kids?
Yeah, mom and dad go on vacation,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden something happens, and now who gets control of the kids? Who gets guardianship? Who's going to take care of them on your behalf, which is pretty important. So, what are the different aspects of estate planning?
Yeah, there's a couple different vehicles. There's trusts, there's wills, power of attorney, and also a lot of things people don't think about initially, but whenever they get in front of an estate planning attorney will bring up are healthcare directives. What would you like to happen to yourself if you were to become incapacitated and couldn't make medical decisions over yourself? So
Mm,
a lot of different important components really make up that whole estate planning picture that you address with an estate planning attorney and that they would help you kind of figure out.
hmm Yeah. So let's start with each one of these. So the will, you know, obviously in the simplest form, it basically is a written document that you sign a date that says, hey, if I were to pass away, here's where all my stuff goes. In its
Hmm.
very simplest form, that's what you have. Um, and then you talked about the power of attorney. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's so one of the good instances where it would come into play is if you couldn't make financial decisions for yourself anymore. So it's a legal document that somebody would use on your behalf that you've specified that can give someone the power to act in your place on your behalf. Um, yeah, and crucial to managing your affairs if you were to become incapacitated. So having that spelled out before something were to happen to you is crucial.
Yeah, because again, these are all situations where it's like, okay, what does this look like when you don't have this? Some
Mhm.
people are like, okay, I think I get it, but what happens if we don't pay attention to this? And what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of times they think, oh, well, I'm a family member. The doctors or the hospital talk to me, and it's like, whoa, let's stop you right there. And that's not
Yeah.
always the case. That is not the case. Sometimes they'll leave, if you don't have a power of attorney, they'll leave some of these decisions to the doctor with or without the
Mhm.
advice of the family, that knows,
Yeah.
the person um, at a deeper level than what the doctor knows. And so that's where I think people don't realize how important that is until they're in that moment and they're like, oh, this is not what I thought this was
Yeah.
going to happen.
Well, and it helps take the pressure off your family not to make those decisions, but who's going to make those decisions,
Yeah.
right? If you've got five siblings, maybe you don't have a wife or you don't have a spouse, you've got five siblings and no parents, which one of your siblings is going to make the decision on
Yeah. And yeah.
house, your accounts, or, health choices?
And each one of the siblings is going to have a different opinion on that, right?
Hmm.
So, really, it really is a matter of saying, "Hey, I have this person or these people there to make those decisions on my behalf." Um,
Yeah.
and really, it's just there to give you peace of mind, knowing that if you are unable to make those decisions, you have named or given somebody else that power of attorney.
Yep. And that also leads into a healthcare directive. Typically, they go hand in hand,
Yep.
um, spelling out your wishes for your health care if you were to become incapacitated. So it spells out, you know, um, like a DNR, if you were to become put on life support, do you want to extend life support past six
Hmm.
months?
Yeah.
You know, that kind of, it can get that specific, right?
Yeah.
Um, But again, if you had five siblings, maybe they wanted to, you know, keep trying no matter what the cost, and you could be incapacitated for a couple of years if that were potentially the circumstance. But
Yeah.
they'd be making that choice for you instead of you making that choice for yourself.
That's right. And that's why the healthcare directive is so important, is because it allows you to basically say, hey, these are my wishes. So you're not leaving it up to somebody else,
Yeah.
you know?
And using the estate planning attorney is great because, right, people don't know what to think about in a lot of these circumstances because it's the first time they've ever thought of it.
Yeah.
planning for their estate wishes. And even consulting an estate attorney is going to be a great way to just start spinning the brain and thinking of things to think about in relation to all these things.
Yeah. Everybody jokes about, pulling the plug, right? And who's going to pull the plug and
Yeah.
do all that stuff. But if you have a healthcare directive, you're like, haha, joke's on you. I already made that decision.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
So, um, absolutely. And, the other topic, you talked about, which can be overly complex, is this whole idea of trusts. And so I want to talk about that just for a second. So, in its basic form, a trust is, another legal document that basically says, okay, if I were to pass away, yes, I'm naming somebody to inherit that money, but I'm also being able to stipulate how they can use that money. Right.
Yep.
And so the whole point of this is to avoid people being their own worst enemies when they're inheriting a certain amount of money.
Yep.
And so this usually comes into play, when you have certain family dynamics that you either want the money to stay within the bloodline, or you just want to have it more protections against outside influences, or like I said earlier, it's a matter of someone, protecting maybe one of their kids from themselves, where they could be really
Yeah.
harmful if they inherit a certain decent of money. If there's things like addiction issues, or self-sabotaging behavior, they're getting into debt quite often. And
Just being
so,
naive,
yeah,
an
exactly. It doesn't have to be ill
18-year-old
intent.
inheriting $1 million.
Right. It could be like, hey, this is probably not the wisest thing in the world, but
Yeah.
um, but that's where I think what happens, the way I always describe it is, a trust is like a safe, right? So the money goes not to the individual outright, but it goes into a safe, and that safe can only be used on behalf of the beneficiary.
Hmm.
And so you have what's called a trustee, and the trustee essentially holds the password to the safe. So the trustee is there to make sure, okay, in your example, Sam, you and Aaron might have said, okay, here's the stipulations that when our money passes to our kids, here's how we want them to be used, or we don't want the money to be used. And so
Yep.
the trustee is kind of the gatekeeper to say, okay, Aaron and Sam have already laid out the stipulations. I'm going to make sure that the beneficiary, who are the kids in this case, are abiding by these stipulations. And so
Yeah.
if they want money, maybe in your case, they said, okay, if it's under 18 or under a certain age, they have to come to you and say, hey, I need a newer vehicle. And you say, sure, okay, that's a legitimate, purpose of this. But you know what? We're not going to go out there and get you a Lamborghini. We're going to get
Yeah.
you something reliable, where
Yeah.
the
Something
kid might,
reasonable.
something reasonable, whereas kids are going to pitch you on, oh, I really need this Porsche, this would really help out, and you're thinking,
Yeah.
well, let's just back up there a little bit here. So that's what the
Yeah.
trustees designed to do in that case. And then of course, the good thing is these trusts you can be as creative as you want to be, and they can be as complex as
Hmm.
you want to be, but that's usually more dependent on really complex family dynamics. When you start getting into you know, whether it's addiction
Quite a few
issues, it could be
beneficiaries.
quite a few beneficiaries, self sabotaging behavior, um, divorce, if there's a history of divorce with certain siblings, bankruptcy, any of those things, the trust really helps say, hey, this is here to help the person and make this money last and be supportive for them, but not also giving them a loaded gun, you know?
That's right. That's a good way to put
So,
it.
and the one thing that's interesting is people always used to think, and I still get this every once in a while, that they're like, oh, isn't, trust just for wealthy people? And it's like, no, it's not. It's really
Yeah.
for anybody that wants to be a good steward and continue to pass down that money in a good, healthy way. And that is
Yeah.
very thoughtful. And so it's not
That's
really
right.
just meant for wealthy people. It's meant for, anybody really.
And it,
So
like you said, it can be as simple or as complex as you want, right? It can just stipulate, hey, I want to hold my house and my outside accounts until my kids are 18, and then give some stipulations onto the spending or to the use of that. Or, in complex circumstances, you could stipulate multiple generations use of that money or
Yeah.
assets or what have you.
Yeah, and I like what you said. You brought up the whole idea of a house, right? So, a vacation home, that's a great example.
Oh
So,
yeah, sure.
if you think like, okay, great, the vacation home, the kids might decide ahead of time, like, hey, we want to keep that. Let's keep that going because that brought great memories for us, and maybe for their kids, they can kind of create those
Yeah.
memories and they want to keep it. In other cases, the kids may say, no, we don't really have any emotional attachment. In fact, let's put it in there so that when mom and dad pass away, that gets liquidated, so everybody can kind of get their share and go their separate way.
Yep.
So, um, but it really is. It can be like you said. I mean, as simple or complex as you want to be, and it's all revolved around the family dynamics, what the wishes are. And I've had both extremes, right? I've had one extreme where parents are just like, you know what, we're just going to give it to them. They can deal with it. We're not going to control beyond the grave, and however they
Yep.
deal with it, we're going to be gone. So it's on them, you know.
Yeah.
And then I've had the other one where it's like, there's pretty tight constricting rules on there, just
Yeah.
because they do want to control a little bit more from the grave, and right or wrong, it's not for us to judge, but it's basically, obviously, it's the money, and they get to decide on what that is, and we're just here to kind of give guidance um
Yep. Lead them in
and
the right
help them.
direction.
That's right. And it's sharing what other families have done, obviously, in a confidential way, and helping
Yeah.
guide those decisions. So again, we don't create any of the estate planning documents here, but we're definitely an advocate on behalf of our clients to help them work with those professionals, whether it be a CPA, or their estate planning attorney.
Yeah. Being a part of that conversation, I think, is crucial because a lot of times clients to their estate planning attorney or what have you may not think of things to bring up where we can kind of bring some of that stuff to light that the client might not have thought is important. And it's like, oh, we've been working with you for the last 10 years. No, we actually need to talk about this probably as well or give some direction on it with the estate planning attorney.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I mean, let's start with some common pitfalls. What do you
Yeah.
think, are some biggest pitfalls slash mistakes, oversight that people have when thinking about estate planning?
Yeah. Again, we were doing a little research, and according to the National Law Review, so of those 32% of Americans that have wills and estate plans, a majority of them actually fail to some degree because of lack of communication and trust among family members. So, not having that communication up to date with that family as outside of the parents maybe, and then communication with the kids, the siblings, and then not updating those estate plans, having disputes within it due to lack of communication, right? That's another thing too that we address with a lot of clients and a lot of new clients as well is when's the last time you updated your estate plan?
Yeah.
In many cases, they're like, oh, yeah, well, we set something up when the kids were born. Well, maybe that was 15 years ago and life's changed and a lot of that may not apply anymore.
Yeah. That's a big one because I think as you get older, especially when you start getting into, your later years, if you're, into your 80s and even 90s, a lot of times, trustees might have passed away. If you had a certain trustee for
Yep.
the kids trust, they might pass away and you think, oh man, they're no longer here. Are they capable? Or, any of those things could happen. So, um, just because you choose one thing or one person to help you with the power of attorney or trustee one day doesn't mean that you'll be the same person, 5, 10
Yeah,
years from now.
that's right. Families change, dynamics change. So, yeah, it's really important to update those things, just like we do on investment accounts whenever we bring those over.
Yeah.
Update beneficiaries. The
Yeah.
same is equally important to any estate planning documents,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, according to the National Law Review, research indicates that 70% of estate plans fail due to a lack of communication and trust among family members. Yikes.
Yeah. That's huge. When you've already got so many few people even properly trying to set up a estate plan for themselves, whether it's just a will, a trust. Um, yeah, it's
Well, I
crucial.
think, those are, if you don't have help with those, right? If you don't have good qualified professionals and a team behind you helping you with that, the hard
Yeah,
part about all that stuff is knowing how to have those conversations. I mean, that probably scares
that's
some
right.
people, me just saying that, like, hey, you have to effectively communicate, some parts of your estate planning to your kids, and it's like, ugh, yikes, where do I even start on that one?
Yeah, or just the oh, maybe being cautious about the costs and
Mm,
then say going to LegalZoom to try and draw up their will, right? The costs vary for all of these things, and in most cases probably get more expensive due to the complexity, but they're probably not as expensive in many cases as most people think, just to set up
hmm.
something basic that protects you and your family.
Yeah. And I think another pitfall too is overthinking and overanalyzing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so it's, you
Analysis
obviously,
paralysis.
oh, totally, totally. And so it's a thin line between one, you want to be very thoughtful, right? This does require some very, deep thinking, hard thinking. But I've seen a lot of people and they will just overanalyze everything and not get anything done. It's like, listen, if we don't put something down, you're risking something happening and then
Yeah.
having a really bad estate plan, which is to have nothing.
Yeah.
So with everyone, we try to kind of guide them and basically tell them, hey, listen, if you don't have all these things thought out today, that's fine. Take some time, talk to your spouse, and really try to understand what's important to you. Let's put something down, you know.
Yeah.
And then the good thing is this can be changed at any time. So if we change our minds later, or if we said, nah, maybe I do change my
That's
mind, I
right.
don't want that person, you can change it. And so now it's just a matter of really having something in place rather than nothing. I've seen that quite a few times where people just
Oh yeah.
stall and then 6 months, 12 months later, it's like, oh yeah, we never got around to that. So
That's why we're here, given that nudge, keep
yeah.
them from kicking the can down the road. Because yeah, I mean, again, it's not set in stone. There's always that person that helped you set up the estate plan. They're always there to help make updates to it if you ever
Hmm.
need to. Yeah, because they
Yeah.
realize that families change, life changes, things get less complex, things get more complex. Yeah, and you can change it
Hmm.
accordingly.
Yeah. So, and I think, the other pitfall, of course, is, when you have a certain life event, whether it's marriage, divorce, birth of a child, all these things affect your estate planning. And so it's always good to review that, just to say, okay, hey, what do we currently have? And how did this life event change anything that we may have in our
Yeah,
documents? And so obviously if a beneficiary passed away, that's going to force you to say, okay, we've got to update this. Or if a
yeah,
spouse unfortunately passed away, you'd have to rethink things. Or if a power of attorney or trustee, got sick or became unhealthy, and you knew that they were unable to perform these duties and these functions, that's going to require you to go back to the estate planning and say, hey, we need to review this again, and may
yeah,
need some tweaks here and there.
yeah, exactly. Um,
um So, with that being said, I think there's, obviously, hopefully this kind of shares with people and it helps them understand that, hey, there's, this isn't the most fun part of financial planning. it's,
yeah,
it's a more morbid, but man, it's easy not to do. And I think there are a ton of stories out there, and celebrity stories out there as well of, celebrities having a very, very large estate and not
hmm
having a simple will. and just the complexity and all the interfamily fights it can create. And all the time, the lawyers are getting rich because they're trying to settle this, and the estate, what was going to be passed dwindles more and
Yeah.
more because people are arguing. So you have to take it to the courts to decide, and then you get attorneys involved, and it's just like, man, they're the ones that end up winning more than anyone.
Debt collectors
Um,
come out,
oh
all the
yeah.
long distance excommunicated family members come out of the woodwork and be like, "Hey, well, I helped him get his career at some point. He owes me now."
Mm-hmm.
All of that happens. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, everyone has to do it, mom
Yeah.
and pop to, big celebrities.
Yeah.
It all goes the same way.
So real quickly here, if because we're gonna wrap up, but if there's one thing that our listeners wanted to get started on today, or said, "Hey, what is one action step I can take?" Sam, what would you think would be?
Yeah. I think there's probably two or three things. If you're working with a financial advisor already, probably reach out to them to ask who they would recommend to help start talking
Yeah.
about an estate plan and getting
Yeah.
some of those documents, getting information on those documents and what might be applicable to them. Then after, maybe sitting down with a couple different estate planning attorneys to see which one might fit your circumstances best, just starting to take an inventory of those bigger assets that are important to you, and kind of putting together a plan of distribution or control of those if something were to happen to you. And then, of course, if you've got kids, um, start thinking about who you would want to take care of those kids of yours, and if you've had that conversation with those people and how you
Mm-hmm.
might breach that conversation, um, you know, if whatever the circumstance arose where that would come into play. And then after consulting those estate planning attorneys, obviously communicating that plan with the important people that are involved with it.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want a surprise of suddenly something happens and you're like, "Oh, you're the executor of the state," and you're like, "I'm what?"
Yeah,
Like, "Huh? Wait a minute, what?"
I'm taking on
Um,
responsibility for your kids. What?
yeah.
Yeah,
So, but that's awesome. Well, again, at Lighthouse Wealth Group, we do not create the estate plans. Our job is really to help implement the estate plans created by the professionals the clients are working with. And so, um,
yep.
we work with the professionals and help guide that and implement those plans. So, hopefully everybody found this a little bit educational. If there's anything we can help with, certainly let us know. I got to just read disclaimer: we do not give tax or legal advice on here, but if there is anything we can help with, we'd be glad to do it. And just appreciate everybody listening. We will see you the next time on the Lighthouse Spotlight. Thanks, everyone.
See you later.